A 17-year-old black girl stood alone in a Springfield, Illinois courtroom, accused of vandalizing city property. But her graffiti wasn't random. It was a bold statement the judge wasn't ready to hear. When he tried to silence her, she fired back with words, straight from the Constitution. Could a teenager, armed only with her dad's old law books, no lawyer and no backup, tip the scales of justice? What would you do in her shoes? Share your thoughts as this story unfolds. Let's step into that courtroom. It was just after 9 a.m. on a sticky Tuesday when the heavy doors of the district courthouse creaked open. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with heat and judgment. Polished oak benches stretched under high ceilings, packed with strangers whispering, papers rustling, and the occasional cough bouncing off the walls like a gavel's echo. The pale walls seemed to watch, waiting for something to break the tension. Then she walked in, Sarah Coleman, 17, alone. No lawyer, no parents, just a slim girl with neatly braided hair and sneakers too worn for the courtroom's gleaming floor. Her eyes scanned the room, hunting for a safe spot to land. There wasn't one. Heads turned, some scowled, others muttered. "That's the kid who tagged City Hall," someone hissed. "No shame at all." Sarah kept moving, chin up, though her fingers shook. The defendant's table felt a mile away. At the front, Judge William Harris loomed, silver-haired, face hard as stone, known across Springfield for his no-nonsense rulings. His eyes flicked over Sarah, then back to his notes, like she was already guilty. Maybe she was, in his mind. Sarah sat, hands clasped tight, shoulders stiff. The weight of the room, the stares, the whispers pressed down on her, heavier than any 17-year-old should carry. Outside, the sun blazed like it was just another day. Inside, for Sarah, a storm was brewing. The prosecutor stood, suit sharp, voice smooth and sure, the kind of guy who never doubted himself. He barely glanced at Sarah. "Your Honor," he started, gesturing toward her with a stiff hand. "This case is cut and dry. The defendant deliberately defaced public property in a brazen act of defiance. He paced, each step ringing out like a judgment. She spray-painted a mural on Springfield City Hall, not some random scribble, but a vivid image of violence and words that attacked our police force's integrity." He paused, leaning forward, voice sharp as a blade. "She did it in broad daylight, cameras caught her, there's no question of guilt. We're seeing a trend. Kids, hyped up by social media, treating our institutions like their personal art projects." He faced Judge Harris. "We're here to restore order, to show this community that actions have consequences." Harris didn't nod or smile. He slid off his glasses, wiped them with a slow, deliberate motion, and said, "So she's a rebel now." The room let out a soft chuckle, quickly hushed. "Enough," Harris went on, voice flat. "A kid with a spray can and too much attitude." He stared at Sarah not with interest but with cold calculation. "Miss Coleman, you're 17. What exactly are you fighting for?" The courtroom walls seemed to close in, but Sarah Coleman didn't break. Judge Harris's words, "This isn't a classroom, Miss Coleman," cut deep, sharp as a blade. She sat back down, hands curling into slow, trembling fists on the table. The room buzzed with murmurs, like leaves rustling before a storm. Sarah stared straight ahead, not at the judge, not at the prosecutor, but at nothing and everything. The sting of being silenced burned, not just as injustice, but as humiliation. Yet she didn't cry or argue. She folded her voice inside her chest, like a secret she'd save for the right moment. Sometimes, the smartest thing a girl can do is wait. In her mind, the courtroom faded. Sarah was 10 again, curled up on a lumpy couch in their Maple Avenue apartment in Springfield. The couch had a wobbly leg, and the blanket smelled of lavender and laundry. Her dad, David Coleman, sat beside her, reading from a heavy law book, his voice calm, each word carrying weight. "This," he said, tapping the worn cover, "is how change happens, Sarah, not by yelling, but by knowing what they don't think you know." "What is it?" she asked, small and curious. "Cases," David said, smiling. "Real people, real fights. They stood up when no one wanted to listen. They knew the law, so the system had to face them." Sarah didn't get it then, but the names stuck like songs. Brown v. Board, Loving v. Virginia, Tinker v. Des Moines. They felt like magic, powerful and untouchable. David had been a history teacher, loved by his students, until he spoke too freely during Black History Month about systemic injustice and police brutality. The school board didn't like it. They told him to stick to the script. He wouldn't. By summer, he was gone. Their home grew quiet after that, not bitter, just hollow. But David never stopped teaching Sarah. Every night he read to her, believing in truth. "Your mind is your shield," he'd say. "Your voice is your sword. Don't let anyone take them." On her 12th birthday, David gave her that book, its pages yellowed and dog-eared. Inside he wrote, "For the day you need it, you will." Years later, during protests in Springfield, Sarah saw footage of a black man shoved to the pavement. David watched, arms crossed, face unreadable. Then he turned to her and said, "The law isn't broken, it's used. Used by people who hope you never learn to read it." Now, in a cold holding room at the courthouse, those words echoed. 4 gray walls, 1 rickety chair, a water fountain that sputtered air. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rustle of papers in Sarah's hands. She sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the wall, a stack of photocopied legal documents spread out like a puzzle. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. She knew it by heart. She underlined the key line again with a dull pencil. "Students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech at the schoolhouse gate. If that held in a school, it had to hold outside one." No lawyer had shown up. No adult had walked in to say, "You've got this." Sarah knew how courtrooms like this saw girls like her, quiet, black, nameless. But she believed in those pages. She believed the Constitution didn't have an asterisk. She believed her dad hadn't given her that book for nothing. In that cramped room, with only David's voice in her head, Sarah made a choice. She'd speak not how they wanted, but how they couldn't ignore. She'd use the law they tried to twist against her. Sarah pressed the pencil flat against her knee and whispered, "They can ignore me, but they can't ignore the truth." It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. The guard opened the door, motioning her back to the courtroom. Sarah stood, not with fear, but with purpose. No one expected her to win. No one expected her to know. That was her edge. Truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs a voice. Sarah Coleman had found hers. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. Harris didn't wait. "We've raised a generation that thinks chaos is purpose," he said, leaning back, "and now they drag that mess into my courtroom." The room fell silent, heavy with tension. Sarah's eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something fiercer, something ready to spark. To everyone else, she was a troublemaker, a headline, a girl too young to get it and too bold to back down. But no one, not even the judge, saw the truth. Yet. Sarah wasn't here to argue, she was here to change history. The silence stretched, then Sarah stood, voice soft but steady. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Harris didn't look up, flipping through his notes like her words didn't matter. "No," he said, the word cutting like a knife. Sarah hesitated, then tried again, quieter. "I'd like to explain." Harris finally met her gaze, his face unchanged. "Explain," he said, voice dry as dust. "This isn't a classroom, Miss Coleman. This is a courtroom." The heavy door of the holding room swung shut behind Sarah Coleman as the guard led her back toward the Springfield courthouse's main chamber. The hallway stretched long and dim, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting shadows on the cold tile floor. Her sneakers squeaked faintly, the photocopied pages of Tinker v. Des Moines clutched tightly under her arm. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady, fueled by the words her father, David Coleman, had drilled into her. "Your voice is your sword." Halfway down the corridor, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Miss Coleman?" The prosecutor stepped from a side doorway, his crisp suit catching the light, his eyes narrowing with a mix of confidence and disdain. He blocked her path, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. The guard paused, stepping back, leaving Sarah to face him alone. "You're digging your own grave," he said, voice low and smooth, like he was stating a fact. "Playing lawyer in there? It's cute, but it's trouble." He leaned closer, his cologne sharp in the stale air. "Keep pushing, and I'll ask Judge Harris to hit you hard. Fines you can't pay, a record that'll haunt you through college. You want that kind of future?" Sarah's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the papers, the weight of his words pressed down, heavy as the courtroom's stairs. She was 17, alone, no lawyer to shield her. The prosecutor's smirk widened, sensing her hesitation. "Plead guilty now," he said, voice softer, almost kind. "I'll push for community service. You walk away clean. Easy." The guard shifted, glancing away. The hallway felt smaller, the walls closing in. Sarah's mind raced. Her dad's voice, the book he gave her, the cases he read aloud on their Maple Avenue couch. She thought of the murals she'd painted on Springfield City Hall, the words she'd sprayed in broad daylight, a truth no one wanted to hear. Pleading guilty would bury it. She lifted her chin, meeting the prosecutor's gaze. Her voice was quiet but steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm not here to make your job easy, sir. I'm here to tell the truth." The prosecutor's smirk faltered, his eyes flashing with surprise, then irritation. He straightened, letting out a dry chuckle that echoed off the walls. "You're out of your depth, kid," he said, but his voice betrayed a crack of unease. He turned, his polished shoes clicking as he walked away, leaving Sarah standing tall. The guard motioned her forward, and Sarah exhaled, her hands still trembling but her resolve ironclad. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, and with every step she felt her father's words ignite inside her. "Your mind is your shield." She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a voice they couldn't silence. The Springfield courthouse buzzed as the session resumed just after 11 a.m. The same polished oak benches held the same stiff faces, but the air felt different, charged with an unspoken shift. Sarah Coleman sensed it in her bones as she took her seat at the defendant's table. Her hands, once trembling, now rested steady, the photocopied pages of Tinker v. Des Moines tucked inside her jacket. The prosecutor's words from the hallway, "You're out of your depth, kid," still echoed, but they didn't shake her. They lit a fire. Her father's voice rang louder, "Your mind is your shield." After staring down the prosecutor's smirk, Sarah wasn't just ready, she was unstoppable. Judge William Harris cleared his throat, adjusting his robe with a flick of his wrist. "We'll resume," he said, nodding to the prosecutor. The man in the crisp suit started to rise, but Sarah was faster. She stood, calm, certain, her 17-year-old frame small but unshakable. A gasp rippled through the back rows. The prosecutor froze, his face twitching with annoyance, as if Sarah had just thrown his script out the window. Harris narrowed his eyes, his gavel hovering. "Miss Coleman," he snapped, voice like gravel, "you weren't asked to speak." Sarah didn't flinch. "I understand, Your Honor," she said, her tone even but firm. "But if this court's deciding my future, I have the right to speak for myself." Murmurs spread like wildfire. The prosecutor shifted, his notes untouched. Harris studied Sarah for a long second, his face unreadable, weighing whether to shut her down or let her dig her own grave. With a dry sigh, he waved a hand. 2 minutes, he said, no more. Sarah nodded, pulling a creased paper from her jacket pocket, its edges worn from her grip. "I'd like to refer this court to the 1969 case of Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District," she began, her voice low but clear, cutting through the room's hum. The courtroom stilled. Even the court reporter's pen paused, her eyes flicking up. Sarah's words gained strength, each one landing like a stone. "The Supreme Court ruled that students don't lose their constitutional rights to free speech at the schoolhouse gate." She paused, letting the weight settle. Harris leaned forward, his disinterest gone. Sarah flipped the paper, revealing a highlighted line. "If that right holds in a school, it holds on the steps of Springfield City Hall. My mural wasn't vandalism, it was protest. It was protected speech, just like Mary Beth Tinker's armband in 1969. Her voice rose, steady, unshaken. "If this court punishes me for it, it doesn't just silence a teenager, it rewrites the law." The room was electric, the silence so thick it hummed. No one laughed, no one whispered. Harris blinked, his mouth parting slightly, caught off guard. The prosecutor's hands froze over his notes, his earlier confidence unraveling. Sarah stood taller, her eyes locked on the judge, not pleading but commanding respect. She wasn't a kid playing dress-up in a courtroom anymore. She was a force. The mural flashed in everyone's minds, the dark outline of a man, hands raised, painted across City Hall's wall, with words that cut deep. "Do I look threatening to you?" It wasn't just art. It was a question. a challenge, a truth Sarah had dared to speak. And now, in this room, she backed it with the Constitution itself. For the first time, the crowd saw her clearly, not as a troublemaker, not as a headline, but as a 17-year-old who'd studied, prepared, and refused to be ignored. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously, the spectators leaned forward, hanging on her words. Even Harris, with his stone-cold reputation, couldn't look away. Sarah had turned the courtroom into her stage, and every eye was on her. This wasn't just a defense, it was a reckoning. Sarah didn't need a lawyer or a loud voice. She had the law, her father's lessons, and a courage that burned brighter than fear. In that moment, they saw her for what she was, a mind that refused to be underestimated, a voice that refused to stay silent. In the back row of the Springfield courthouse, Rachel Sullivan sat frozen, her notebook open, pen pressed against her lip. She'd come to cover a routine case, a 17-year-old charged with vandalism, a story barely worth a paragraph. But when Sarah Coleman stood and quoted Tinker v. Des Moines, the room shifted. Sarah's voice, steady and sharp, wasn't just a defense, it was a spark. Her words, "They can't ignore the truth," hit Rachel like a memory, stirring something deep and familiar. Rachel's mind drifted to Maple Avenue 12 years ago. She was a junior at Springfield Community College, sitting in David Coleman's history class, room 204, where the windows never opened. David didn't just teach the Constitution, he made it pulse. The First Amendment isn't just words, he'd say. It's a mirror. Look in it, decide who you are. Rachel had idolized him. One day, after she published a piece in the student paper about police overreach, the administration pushed back. David pulled her aside, his eyes calm but fierce. "If they're angry you said something worth saying, keep going." That was the first time anyone told Rachel her voice mattered. Now, watching Sarah, she heard that same fire, that same cadence. Coleman, it clicked. Rachel hadn't seen him in years. Rumors said he'd lost his teaching job, maybe left town, maybe blacklisted. But here was his legacy, alive in a 17-year-old girl who'd just turned a courtroom upside down with a Supreme Court case. Rachel's pen hit the page, her heart racing. Sarah's voice wasn't just powerful, it was a call to action. The mural Sarah painted on Springfield City Hall flashed in Rachel's mind. A man's face, hands raised, eyes wide, with the words, "Am I a threat?" It wasn't graffiti. It was a question the city needed to answer. Rachel knew this wasn't just a local story. It was bigger. During the next recess, Rachel slipped out of the courtroom, her steps quick and purposeful. She found a bench under an oak tree outside the courthouse, the Illinois sun warm on her shoulders. Opening her laptop, her fingers flew across the keys, not just as a reporter, but as someone who'd once been taught to fight for truth. Her article was sharp, urgent. 17-year-old stuns Springfield court with Supreme Court defense of free speech. She quoted Sarah word for word, described the mural's raw power, and tied it to David Coleman, the teacher who'd shaped her own courage. Rachel hit publish, her pulse pounding. Within an hour, the story spread like wildfire. Local news sites picked it up, then regional blogs, then national threads. People commented, shared, argued, defended, but most importantly, they listened. Sarah's mural, her words, her stand in that courtroom stopped being just a case. It became a movement. Back inside, Rachel returned to her seat, her notebook now filled with scribbled notes. Sarah didn't notice her. Didn't need to. Rachel wasn't there to be seen. She was there to make sure Sarah was. As she watched Sarah sit tall, chin high, facing a judge who finally seemed to waver, Rachel felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that sticks. The kind that grows when one voice dares to speak and others dare to amplify it. The courtroom hummed with tension, but outside the world was starting to hear Sarah Coleman's truth. Rachel's article wasn't just a report. It was a bridge, carrying a 17-year-old's courage from a small Illinois courthouse to anyone willing to listen. And they were listening, more with every click, every share, every whispered conversation. Sarah had lit the spark and Rachel had fanned the flame. The Springfield courthouse fell silent, a hush deeper than any routine recess. Judge William Harris entered from his chambers, his steps slower, his face unreadable. His robe was crisp, his hands steady, but his eyes carried something new. A flicker of doubt rare for a man who'd ruled over thousands of cases. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and looked straight at Sarah Coleman. The 17-year-old sat tall at the defendant's table, her gaze unwavering, the weight of her words from the trial still hanging in the air. Harris had spent the recess alone, the courtroom's buzz muted behind his chamber door. A bailiff had slipped in, showing him a news alert on his phone. 17-year-old's courtroom stand goes viral. Sarah's story was everywhere, but Harris barely glanced at it. Public noise didn't sway him. What gnawed at him was quieter, sharper, a memory of his early days on the bench when he'd promised himself to listen, not just rule. He thought of a case years ago, a young man punished for speaking out, his story dismissed because he was too emotional. Harris had moved on then, called it justice. Now Sarah's voice, calm, precise, rooted in law, made him question what he'd missed, not just today, but for years. He pictured the mural on Springfield City Hall, a man's face, hands raised, with "Am I a threat?" scrawled beneath. At first, he'd seen it as defiance, a teenager's stunt. But Sarah's argument, grounded in Tinker v. Des Moines, forced him to look closer. It wasn't chaos, it was speech, protected and piercing. Harris gripped the case file, his knuckles tight. He'd built his career on being unshakable, but this girl, with no lawyer and nothing but her father's lessons, had cracked that arm, not with tears or anger, but with truth. The silence broke as Harris spoke, his voice steady but softer than usual. "Ms. Coleman," he began, "I've spent 23 years on this bench, delivering rulings I believed were fair. Today, I nearly failed that standard." Heads turned, brows furrowed. Sarah stayed still, her hands folded. "I looked at you and saw a child, not a voice. I assumed your age meant you couldn't carry the weight of this room. I was wrong." He glanced at the mural's photo in the evidence pile, its question staring back. "Your mural isn't just paint. It's a challenge, one this court almost ignored. Your words today, backed by law, reminded me what justice demands. Not just order, but listening." The room was still, every word sinking in. "I'm not swayed by headlines or crowds. I'm swayed by you, a 17-year-old who held this court to its own principles." A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. Rachel Sullivan in the back lowered her pen, her eyes misty. Harris's voice grew firm. "This court rules in favor of the defendant. All charges against Sarah Coleman are dismissed." His gavel tapped, sharp and final. Then he leaned forward, no longer just a judge. "And I recommend the mural stay untouched, a reminder that justice needs voices like yours to keep it honest." Sarah didn't smile or cry. She nodded once, her face calm, like she'd always known the truth would win. The courtroom stayed quiet, no applause needed. Something had shifted, not just in law, but in hearts. The courthouse doors swung open, sunlight flooding through. Sarah stepped out, no handcuffs, no shame, just steady steps and a breath she'd held all morning. Reporters lingered, cameras ready, but they kept their distance, sensing the moment's weight. The crowd hushed, not out of boredom, but awe. They didn't see a defendant, they saw a voice that refused to break. Then, through the crowd, Sarah saw him, David Coleman, in a worn gray sweater, a law book under his arm, eyes wet with pride. He opened his arms, and Sarah walked into them, his embrace tight, holding all the years the world had tried to tear them apart. "You did it, kid," he whispered. "You made them listen." 6 months had passed since the Springfield courthouse doors swung open, setting Sarah Coleman free. The mural on Toothy Chin Springfield still stood, its bold lines, a man's face, hands raised with "Am I a threat?" now a landmark. Tourists snapped photos, locals paused to reflect, and the city council, swayed by Judge Harris's ruling, voted to preserve it as a symbol of truth. For Sarah, now 18, life had changed. Her name wasn't just a headline anymore, it was a spark, igniting conversations across Illinois and beyond. On a crisp fall morning, Sarah stood in a crowded community center in downtown Springfield, facing a sea of young faces. The Springfield Youth Forum had invited her to speak about free speech, a topic she'd once defended with nothing but her father's law book and her own courage. Her sneakers, still a little scuffed, tapped nervously against the stage floor, but her eyes were steady, scanning the room. Students, teachers, and activists filled the seats, their notebooks open, phones recording. Rachel Sullivan sat in the back, her reporter's pen ready, her latest article already drafting in her mind. Teens' courtroom victory inspires a generation. Sarah gripped the microphone, her voice soft but clear. I was 17, standing in a courtroom, told to sit down and shut up, she began. They saw a kid, not a voice, but I had something they didn't expect. The law. The room leaned in, hanging on her words. She told her story, the mural, the trial, the moment she quoted Tinker v. Des Moines and made a judge listen. You don't need to be loud or rich or old to fight for what's right. You just need to know your rights and use them. The crowd nodded, some clapping, but a man in the front row stood, his face tight. You're a hero to some, but others call you a troublemaker, he said, voice sharp. That mural stirs up hate, divides our city. Was it worth it? Murmurs rippled through the room, heads turning. Sarah's heart raced, the echo of the prosecutor's smirk flashing in her mind. But she didn't waver. Truth always stirs things up, she said, her voice firm. That mural asks a question we're still too scared to answer. If it makes you uncomfortable, good, it's supposed to. Change starts there. The man sat, silent, his challenge met. The room erupted in applause, not just for her words, but for her refusal to back down. Rachel scribbled faster, her eyes bright with pride. After the talk, Sarah slipped out to Maple Avenue, where David Coleman waited in their small apartment. The same lumpy couch, the same lavender-scented blanket. David set down his coffee, his law book open on the table, and looked at his daughter. They're listening now, kid, he said, his voice thick. But they'll push back, always do. Sarah nodded, sitting beside him. That guy today? He called me a troublemaker. Sounded like the prosecutor all over again. She laughed softly, but her eyes were serious. Am I doing this right, Dad? David leaned forward, his hand on hers. You're doing what I taught you. Speaking when they want you quiet. Change isn't easy, Sarah. It's messy, it's loud, and it's worth it. He tapped the law book. Keep teaching them. They're ready. That evening, Sarah walked to Tuathichin Springfield alone, the mural glowing under streetlights. The paint had faded slightly, but the question, am I a threat, still burned bright. She traced the letters with her fingers, feeling the weight of every stare, every whisper, every cheer from the past year. She wasn't just a girl who'd won a case. She was a voice that had sparked a movement, a teenager who'd shown a generation they could speak, learn, fight. Sarah smiled, small but certain. The world wasn't fixed, not yet. But every student in that room today, every kid watching Rachel's next article spread online, was proof her spark was catching. She turned, her shadow long against the mural, and walked home to Maple Avenue, ready for whatever came next. Because when one voice rises, others follow, and Sarah Coleman's was only the beginning. This story isn't just Sarah's. It's a lesson for all of us. Her courage shows that one voice, armed with truth, can shift the world. In your life, don't wait for permission to speak up. Whether it's calling out unfairness at school, work, or in your community, your words matter. Start small, learn your rights, ask questions, stand firm. Like Sarah, you might face pushback, but that's when you know you're onto something real. What's a truth you've wanted to speak? How will you use your voice? Drop a comment below, share your story, or tell us how Sarah's fight inspires you. We're reading every word. And thank you for joining us on this journey. Your support keeps these stories alive, sparking change, one view at a time.